This is a mysterious story about secrets hidden in an old garden and the last flower that became a symbol of truth and justice. Enjoy the intriguing journey through the twists and turns of this detective tale. Chapter 1. The Fading Garden. Miss Marple carefully adjusted the lace collar on her dress and cast a thoughtful glance at the small garden in front of Mrs. Jenkins' house. The elderly neighbor had passed away a week ago, and now her house stood empty while the once beautiful garden was gradually falling into neglect. How symbolic, thought Miss Marple as she settled onto the bench. At her age, one becomes especially aware of how quickly time slips through one's fingers, like sand in an hourglass. Her gaze rested on a lonely hydrangea flower still clinging to life in the corner of the garden, the last bloom among withered leaves. At that moment, the gate creaked softly, and a young woman entered. Mrs. Jenkins' daughter, Emily. Her face expressed worrying, which was quite unusual for this normally cheerful person. Miss Marple, she addressed her in a trembling voice, I must speak with you. Mother. Mother was being threatened before her death. The elderly lady looked attentively at her companion over her glasses. My dear, are you sure? Mrs. Jenkins seemed so peaceful. I found letters, interrupted Emily, strange unsigned notes. The last one said, the last flower will wither away with you. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing. She noticed some movement out of the corner of her eye in the window of the house across the street. Mrs. Hart, another neighbor known for her curiosity, was standing there. But something about her gaze seemed unusual to Miss Marple. She was watching them too intently. Tell me more about these letters, dear, Miss Marple said gently, while her sharp mind had already begun connecting the first threads of the mystery. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the fading garden, and in the air there was already a sense of mystery looming, which, as Miss Marple knew from experience, would surely find its resolution if only one observed carefully and drew the right conclusions from the smallest details. She looked again at the last hydrangea flower, so fragile and yet surprisingly resilient. How much longer would it last? And what was behind those strange notes? Chapter 2. The Mystery Behind the Lace Curtains. Miss Marple invited Emily into her cozy cottage, where a teapot of herbal blend was already steaming on the antique table, her signature recipe for special occasions. She always believed that a good cup of tea could loosen even the tightest tongues. Let's take a look at those notes, dear, she said gently, carefully accepting several folded sheets of paper from Emily. The first note was written in neat handwriting. The flowers in your garden have begun to wither. Soon you will follow them. The second sounded more threatening. Each day takes a piece of you. Leave while you still can. And the third, the last one, the last flower will wither away with you. The notes came once a week during the last 3 weeks before Mother's death, explained Emily, nervously fiddling with the hem of her dress. But Mother, she never spoke about it. I only found them because I was going through her things. Miss Marple thoughtfully shook her head. As a professional observer of human nature, she knew that people often hid their fears behind a mask of normalcy. But there was something more here. What about these? She asked, pointing to several barely noticeable marks in the margins of the notes. Emily looked surprised. I thought they were just random marks. No, dear. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with her characteristic investigator's enthusiasm. These are definitely some kind of symbols. See, 3 dashes here, 2 dots there. It looks like a code. At that moment, Mrs. Hart, the same curious neighbor Miss Marple had noticed earlier, knocked on the window. Her face expressed deliberate serenity, but Miss Marple's experienced eye caught slight tension at the corners of her mouth. Sorry to bother you, she said casually. I just wanted to check if everything was all right. I saw you enter poor Mrs. Jenkins' garden. Miss Marple noted to herself how the woman deliberately emphasized the word poor, as if prematurely counting her among the deceased. Thank you, "Everything is fine," she replied in her usual friendly manner. "We were just reminiscing about our departed friend." When Mrs. Hart walked away, Emily suddenly exclaimed, "My God! What if this is somehow connected to that old case?" "What case, dear?" Miss Marple became alert. "Mother once worked as a secretary for Judge Langford. Remember the scandal 20 years ago with the missing documents? I think she started working for him around that time." Something clicked in Miss Marple's mind. Yes, she remembered that case. Important documents related to a very delicate trial had disappeared, and the investigation found nothing. Judge Langford soon retired, and his assistants. Interesting. Where did they all go afterward? "Dear, did your mother ever mention those times?" Miss Marple asked cautiously. She always cut off the conversation when her work for the judge came up. She only said that those years greatly influenced her life. Miss Marple carefully examined the notes again. The paper was of high quality, not something you could buy in an ordinary store. And the watermark. Yes, she was sure she had seen the same one in the court office many years ago. It was getting dark. The last rays of sun filtered through the lace curtains, creating intricate patterns on the wall, like a cipher waiting to be deciphered. Miss Marple felt that all the puzzle pieces were gradually starting to form a complete picture. "You know, dear," she said thoughtfully, "I think we should visit the garden again. In daylight, you can miss a lot, but in the evening, in the twilight, details often reveal themselves that remain unnoticed during the day." Emily looked at her questioningly. "Do you think there might be something important there?" "Oh, I'm sure of it." Miss Marple smiled her enigmatic smile. "Gardens, you know, hold many secrets. Especially old gardens. They, just like people, can tell us a lot, if you know how to ask them properly." Chapter 3. Secrets of the Old Garden. When Miss Marple and Emily returned to the garden at Mrs. Jenkins' house, twilight had already enveloped it in a soft grey blanket. The old rose bushes looked like shadows from the past, and the last rays of the setting sun created an intricate play of light and shadow among the intertwined branches. "You know, dear," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, slowly circling the garden, "gardens are very much like people. They hide their secrets behind outer beauty, just as people conceal their secrets under a mask of normalcy." She stopped near an old gazebo, almost completely hidden by ivy. Running her hand over the wood, she noticed something unusual, several fresh scratches on the wooden crossbar. "Look at this," she called to Emily. "These are quite new marks. Someone was here recently and hastily rummaged through these boards." Indeed, upon closer inspection, it became clear that one of the boards had been recently broken and then poorly replaced. Miss Marple carefully pried it up with her umbrella, revealing a small hollow where something valuable had clearly been stored. "There was something rectangular here," Miss Marple noted, examining the empty space carefully. "And judging by the marks, it had been there for quite some time." At that moment, a strange sound from the house across the street caught their attention. It was Mrs. Hart again, supposedly watering her flowers, but doing it too enthusiastically for that time of day. "How curious," Miss Marple muttered to herself. "Mrs. Hart is definitely watching us. But why?" Deciding not to focus on this for now, she continued inspecting the garden. Near the old oak tree, where Mrs. Jenkins used to enjoy her morning tea, Miss Marple noticed something shiny among the roots. Carefully retrieving the object, she discovered an old-fashioned cufflink with engraving. "Well, here's our first real piece of evidence," she said satisfactorily. "This cufflink clearly doesn't belong to your mother. It's too masculine an item, and quite expensive, judging by the quality of workmanship." Emily examined the find closely. "This letter. It looks like an L." Yes. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled. "It would be interesting to know how many people with this initial live in our town. Though, of course, it could just be a coincidence." Suddenly, a sound came from the house. Someone was clearly moving inside. The women froze. "But I thought the house was locked," Emily whispered. "It should be," Miss Marple frowned. "Your mother was always very careful about that." They cautiously approached the house. A silhouette flashed in the living room window, but when they entered, there was no one there. However, a postcard lay on the hall table, brand new, as if it had just been placed there. Emily paled. Its mother's handwriting. Indeed, the postcard bore a short note. "If you're reading this, I'm right. The old diary is under the third board in the library. Don't trust the neighbors." Miss Marple thoughtfully shook her head. "It seems your mother anticipated something like this. I wonder why she decided to leave these clues now. Maybe she realized time was running out," Emily suggested. "Very likely," Miss Marple agreed. "Now let's take a look at this mysterious third board." In the library, after a few minutes of searching, they indeed found a slightly protruding floorboard. Beneath it was a secret compartment containing an old leather diary and another sheet of paper. The sheet contained just one sentence: "All answers are in Langford's garden." "So that's it," Miss Marple whispered, her eyes lighting up with understanding. "It seems the story with Judge Langford goes much deeper than we could have imagined. Your mother must have discovered something important. But why didn't she go to the police?" Emily wondered. "Oh dear," Miss Marple sighed. "Sometimes the truth is so dangerous that it's easier to keep it secret, especially when influential people are involved." Opening the diary, they found numerous entries written in Mrs. Jenkins' neat handwriting. The first pages were dedicated to her work for the judge, followed by some numbers and dates, and then a detailed description of gardening work at the Langfords' estate. "You know," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "I recall a story that happened many years ago in our town. They said Judge Langford often held important meetings precisely in his garden. He believed no one could overhear them there." Chapter 4. The Garden of Memories. The next morning, armed with notes from Mrs. Jenkins' diary and her ever-present umbrella, Miss Marple set off to the Langford estate. Emily stayed home to go through her mother's remaining records. The elderly sleuth believed it was sometimes better to divide the work to ensure nothing was missed. The estate looked abandoned. The tall wrought iron gates were rusted, and the once majestic mansion was now hidden behind thick ivy growth and wild vegetation. However, the garden, though neglected, still bore traces of its former splendor. "How symbolic," thought Miss Marple, examining ancient statues almost completely covered with moss. "Time erases external beauty, but the most important secrets remain hidden beneath the surface." She began her inspection of the Rose Alley, which Mrs. Jenkins had described in detail in her diary. It mentioned a special place where the judge liked to hold his secret meetings. According to the notes, it was somewhere between two stone lions that adorned the entrance to the garden gazebo. Approaching closer, Miss Marple noticed something unusual. One of the paving stones on the path was slightly raised, as if it had been recently touched. Carefully examining the spot, she discovered a small hollow under the stone containing an old key and a note, for those who know where to look. "Well, here's another piece of our puzzle," she muttered to herself. The key was antique, clearly made many years ago. The letter L was engraved on its end. Continuing her examination, Miss Marple noticed a strange drawing in the diary, a garden plan with several marks. One of them pointed to an old greenhouse at the far end of the property. When she reached it, she found that although the building itself had suffered greatly from time, the massive door was still in good condition and had a keyhole that fit the found key. The lock yielded with a creak, revealing an interior filled with shadows of the past. Inside was dim, but even through dusty windows, one could make out the outlines of old flower pots and gardening tools. However, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a large wooden box in the corner of the room. Opening it, she discovered a veritable trove of information, old documents, photographs, and several letters. Among them stood out an official letter with the court seal, dated the very year of the scandal with the missing documents. "Well, well," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, looking through the papers. "It seems these are the evidence of that very case. But why did the judge hide them here? And how did Mrs. Jenkins find out about this?" At that moment, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning around, she saw Mrs. Hart, who appeared not at all surprised to find her there. "I knew you'd get here sooner or later," the neighbor said calmly. "You are so observant." "And so are you," responded Miss Marple, carefully studying the woman's expression. "You've been watching every step we took," Mrs. Hart sighed. "I just wanted to make sure you were on the right track." I knew Mrs. Jenkins well. We both worked for Judge Langford. "So you were that second secretary," Miss Marple deduced. "The one who disappeared immediately after the scandal." "Yes," the woman nodded. "Elizabeth, Mrs. Jenkins and I accidentally discovered these documents. They could have ruined the careers of many influential people. We decided to hide them and pretend we knew nothing." "But why would someone decide to eliminate Mrs. Jenkins now?" asked Miss Marple. "Someone found out that she kept copies of the documents," explained Mrs. Hart. "She received an anonymous letter demanding their return. We thought everyone had forgotten about this case by now." "And who is behind these letters?" continued to inquire Miss Marple. Mrs. Hart shook her head. "I'm not sure. But I think it's connected to the son of one of those officials. He often visits town and takes great interest in his father's old cases." When she returned home, Miss Marple found Emily studying the last pages of her mother's diary. The girl was pale. "There's an entry here saying that Mom saw someone in the night before her death," Emily said in a trembling voice. "She writes that the person was dressed all in black and searching for something in the garden." "Interesting," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "By the way, dear, does the name Arthur Blackwood sound familiar to you?" Emily flinched. "Yes. He recently bought the house across from us." "But why do you ask?" "Because," Miss Marple said slowly, "his father was one of those very officials 20 years ago. And I bet that the cufflink we found belongs to him." Chapter 5. The final chord. The next morning, Miss Marple decided to pay a visit to Arthur Blackwood. She knew that sometimes the most direct path to the truth was open confrontation. Emily insisted on accompanying her, but Miss Marple, as always, preferred to act alone. "My dear," she said gently, "sometimes it's better to leave such matters to professionals. You should stay and continue studying your mother's diary." Arthur Blackwood's house was a modern building of glass and concrete, sharply contrasting with the traditional architecture of the surrounding homes. The owner himself turned out to be a tall man with cold gray eyes, a typical representative of the business world, thought Miss Marple. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" His voice was polite, but tension could be felt in it. "How can I assist the eldest resident of our town?" "Oh, I just wanted to ask a few questions about your father," she replied calmly. "You often take an interest in his old affairs, don't you?" Blackwood visibly tensed. "I don't understand what you're talking about." "Of course, you do," Miss Marple continued calmly. "You see, I recently discovered interesting documents in the old Langford greenhouse, and a cufflink with the initials AB. Quite a coincidence, isn't it?" The man's face darkened. "If you're implying something—" "Oh, I'm not implying," Miss Marple interrupted him. "I'm directly stating that you were the man in black that Mrs. Jenkins saw the night before her death. You were searching for those documents she hid many years ago." "This is absurd," exclaimed Blackwood, but his voice trembled. "Not at all," Miss Marple continued. "Your father is seriously ill now, and you're afraid that old scandals might ruin his reputation. But do you know what's most interesting, Mrs. Jenkins never intended to make those documents public. She just wanted to be sure they would be safe. Blackwood sank into a chair, suddenly looking several years older. I didn't mean her any harm. I just wanted to retrieve the documents. But when she refused to hand them over, you threatened her, Miss Marple finished for him, and kept threatening until it became too dangerous for her. But do you know what's saddest? Your father doesn't even know about these documents. He's long forgotten about that scandal. What should I do now? Whispered Blackwood. Tell the truth, Miss Marple said firmly. Truth has a way of setting us free, you know. At least for Mrs. Jenkins' memory. Asterisk. Later that day, Miss Marple sat in her garden with Emily. They both remained silent, watching the last rays of the setting sun. So Mum died from stress, Emily finally said. From constant fear and anxiety. Yes, Miss Marple nodded. But she was a very brave woman. She kept those documents, not for herself, but for justice. And now that the truth is revealed, she can truly be laid to rest. And what will happen to Arthur Blackwood? Emily asked. He confessed everything to the police, Miss Marple replied. And although he didn't commit anything illegal, his confession will help many people find peace. After all, sometimes truth is more important than punishment. Emily took her mother's last note. I'm glad it's over. And I thank you for helping uncover this mystery. Miss Marple smiled. You know, my dear, life is like a garden. Sometimes we find beautiful flowers there, and sometimes thorny bushes. But every element has its place and meaning. The main thing is to properly understand the message they carry. She looked at her old garden, where the last flowers still clung to life despite the approaching autumn. How symbolic, she thought, because even when it seems everything is lost, somewhere deep inside there's always hope for a new spring. Thank you for listening to The Last Flower in the Garden. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel for more captivating tales and mysteries.